thinking about it. Something really witty and clever, like, so long, fucker. Holy shit. I didn't expect them to bounce. Goddamn.
My ass got skipped across the water.
Hello everybody and welcome back to Game & Lore. My name is Glitch and today we'll be continuing the Halloween festivities from last year. If you remember, we covered the original Five Nights at Freddy's, going into the finer details of some of its qualities and really taking in that decade-old horror nostalgia. Jeez, it's kinda crazy, it's been a year already, it's been so long and yet time has gone by so quickly. I'm not gonna spoil my thoughts on that game here, so if you haven't seen that video, I would definitely recommend you go check that one out first. Several points referenced in this video will be reflecting on some of the things I covered in that previous video, and I would hope you're at least somewhat curious about what I thought about that first game now that I brought it up, especially if you're gonna watch me review the second game. I'm not judging, mind you, it's not mandatory, but, you know, you might like that video too. If you have seen it though, good for you. I really do appreciate that you took the time to watch that previous review from last year. Noole and I put in a lot of effort to make that video and, you know, I'm glad you watched it. Now, with that said though, plug aside, I suppose it's time we tackle another terrifying title under the Fazbear brand with Five Nights at Freddy's 2. Much like its predecessor, Five Nights at Freddy's 2 was developed in ClickTeam Fusion 2.5 by game developer Scott Cawthon. After the first game released on August 8th of 2014, Scott would later tease a sequel in September with a 2015 release window on his website, scottgames.com. I'm just going to go on a brief side thing here and say that scottgames.com was the place for Five Nights at Freddy's fans after the first game came out. While not used for teasers or anything when the first game was coming out other than an image declaring the game existed, scottgames.com would become iconic for being the go-to site for updates, teasers, secrets, and more regarding upcoming Five Nights at Freddy's projects. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 would go on to receive a total of 5 of these teaser images, which included an introduction to several of the new foes and mechanics coming to the sequel entry. I'll go into more detail on the elements that were featured in those teasers later in the video. Anyway, for Kid Me, these were incredibly hype. There were tons of videos on YouTube back in the day when a new teaser came out and people would speculate what it could mean for the upcoming game. It makes me kind of sad, in a sense, thinking back on it. ScottGames.com hasn't been used in a long time. The last post made on the website was of Scott's retirement, yet even that was removed eventually. It just sits there now, empty and void. A relic of a different time, a younger time. I would have liked if it had received anything at all for old time's sake during the 10th anniversary last year, but I suppose all good things must come to an end eventually. Reminiscing aside, there really isn't too much to discuss regarding this game's development window due to its incredibly short development period, outside of the fact that Scott wanted this entry to be chaotic compared to the first game, which, oh boy, does it get chaotic. Now, see, remember how I said this game was slated for a 2015 release? It actually ended up coming out on November 10th of 2014, just 3 months after the first game did. Indeed, this would become a trend for the franchise early on, pushing games out at fast rates after very short periods of time baking in the game dev oven, both for better and for worse, though those times have long since passed for the franchise. Already jumping in, we find ourselves in the new and improved Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, and while we're forced to sit and survive like in the first game, seemingly not straying too far from that original game's basic structure, there's some kind of draft in here because there are absolutely zero closable doors now. Instead, having 2 vents on either side of the room accompanied by light buttons and then just a giant doorway that stares down a hallway in the dead center of your POV. It's very intimidating going from the safety of doors in the first game to having no doors whatsoever in the second, which I think is a good idea for how to take returning players by surprise who come back for a sequel, even if this comes at the cost of introducing some other somewhat finicky mechanical choices to work around the lack of doors. While the cameras are still here, Five Nights at Freddy's 2 gameplay completely chunks that iconic door mechanic in favor of a collection of new ones: the battery system, the Freddy mask, and the music box. We'll start with the most familiar of the new mechanics, the battery system. Returning from the first game is the power system, but now it's handled differently. More of a rework than an entirely new mechanic. You now have a single battery, which is somehow tied to the camera system's own set of lights, but also a flashlight that you beam down that giant hallway. I don't really have any idea how this works, but we're just gonna chalk it up to being some kind of weird paranormal thing. That seems pretty standard for this franchise, so we'll just chalk it up to that. It's also established in the first of the phone calls that this building actually won't run out of power throughout the night.
You may have noticed there are no doors for you to close. But hey, you have lights, and even though your flashlight can run out of power, the building cannot. So don't worry about the place going dark.
There's never any reason to be concerned about not having access to the lights attached to the vents on the sides of the office. That's actually kind of a really good plus here, you know? Additionally, due to this, your camera system no longer drains your power reserve, so your power mechanic is entirely tied between your camera lights and your flashlight, so what do you have to worry about? Now, supposedly, the flashlight system stalls most of the animatronics, but even if that is true, there really is no point in wasting it on anybody but one animatronic in particular, which I'll get to him later. There isn't very much to say about the battery system this time around as there was with the first game, because it just is sort of more of the same, but also kind of less. I personally think it's a lot more convoluted by comparison to the first game, where everything contributed to the power loss, so it made using your defense as a tactical choice you needed to use sparingly in different ways, be it direct defense or information gathering. Here, only some stuff affects the power system, and the parts that do matter are almost exclusively used to deal with a singular animatronic, because if you try to use it on anyone else, you're almost certainly going to run out before the night's over with. It just feels so inferior to the far more engaging and mindful way it was handled in the prior game. I'm just not a fan of its utilization in this entry. Now, moving on to our first proper new mechanic, we have the Freddy mask, an honestly grim perspective of what your fate will be if you get caught in this game. This bad boy is your ticket to dealing with the vast majority of the animatronics this time around. Since there are no doors, you're going to have the animatronics head directly to your office, since they're designed to go to any room with bright lights and loud sounds, since that usually indicates that there are people and or a party going on, which, I mean, your room checks all the boxes in the dead of night. It's like after hours. Of course they're going to head that way. So, to stave them, you're going to need to put on the mask in order to avoid them. It also kind of doesn't help that they just get very ominous in the presence of adults, so that probably won't help your case if you aren't wearing the mask when they find you. Luckily, the animatronics won't be able to recognize your face if you're wearing it, which is a great reference to the first game in that they thought that you were a bare endo that needed to be put in a suit. In fact, they directly address that reasoning in the very first call of the game, so that's pretty snazzy. Mind you, there are some notes regarding the Freddy mask that I should probably elaborate on. As I briefly mentioned, most, but not all of the animatronics are affected by this mask, each of the exceptions being tied to the battery and music box respectively. You're going to frequently be using this mask because of that fact. since there's so many characters to deal with in this game, which I think reveals the biggest reason this mechanic is inferior to the doors. The door system allowed proper breathing room in the original game, since having it closed would prevent all animatronics that can come from that door from entering, and you could still address the opposite side of the office or use cameras while the door remained shut. But here with the mask, you could go from preventing and waiting out an animatronic only to immediately have to turn around and deal with another one that requires the mask, and then this can just chain into you not having the time to deal with the guys behind the flashlight and music box mechanics. This is especially a problem because you can only wait out one animatronic at a time, which is especially awful when there's 9 of them total that center around this mechanic, and some of them have designated hiding periods where you have to wait for them to run their course a preset amount of time before they leave, and then you can take off the mask safely. This is unlike how the animatronics worked in the original, where their movement opportunity system, while somewhat random, still meant they could leave from your door really quickly or really slowly, and you could still address multiple at once without being forced to only deal with one for a preset period of time. The mask is a tough crap scenario in Five Nights at Freddy's 2 because you can just immediately get comboed by back-to-back animatronic encounters and just be left helpless in the process due to the mask being a full commitment mechanic. It's ride or die, and sometimes the cost is dying even if you choose to ride, because it just forces you to ride for entirely too long, so you end up dying anyway. This actually leads into the other new mechanic, which I feel has a somewhat similar issue. The music box is tied to a completely new character called the Puppet, who sits in the box in the prize corner of camera 11. The music box plays a song, and the puppet sleeps during this melody, but should the music box not be rewound in time, the puppet will leave its hiding place and head right for the office. When this happens, death is certain. There's no avoiding this fate. It's a pretty straightforward mechanic, but I think this is the most important of the 3 new ones because the entire gameplay loop practically revolves around soothing the savage beast while dealing with all of the others actively running about. This has a lot of effects on the gameplay, such as how it removes the need to look at any of the other cameras incredibly early on. Ideally, you're not going to want to look at the cameras in later nights too much because of how many animatronics are present and how aggressive they are when it comes to visiting your office, so you won't really have time to be checking anyway. But while this also somewhat existed in Five Nights at Freddy's 1 thanks to Foxy and Pirate's Cove, you didn't have to start using a camera camping strat until comparatively much later into the game's 7 nights. It's also worth stating that, as I mentioned in that previous review video, Foxy's progress rate from Pirate's Cove is not dependent on a singular camera. Sure, you would ideally want to keep an eye on him in the first game, but he can be delayed just by having the cameras open in general, which at least alleviates some of the camera campiness to keep track of some of the other members despite what you would initially think, namely Freddy on camera 4B. That's not really the case with the music box in this game though. It's camera specific, so now there's literally no reason to ever use any of the other cameras at any point, especially by the time you get back to the back half of Night 3 onward, where there's just entirely too much going on to be checking any other camera without risking being killed for sitting in them for just a bit too long. Of course, this mechanic is important in that it keeps you from just sitting in your mask all night and occasionally lifting it to use the modified battery mechanic, but it's still not really great in execution because it kind of chunks the camera mechanic completely out the window a lot earlier than it did in the first game. Now, obviously, you should get your fill of the room design by the time you get to the 3rd night anyway, but it's just kind of a shame you're forced to basically forgo any camera but 11 by that halfway point. It's also another full send mechanic like the Freddy mask is, where everything else stops while you hastily pray that the animatronics will have just the right amount of RNG to actually give you time to wind this thing up. I'm not super crazy about this mechanic from a gameplay perspective, especially when paired with the other 2, since it kind of just overshadows most everything else, and I think it contributes to a larger issue I have with the gameplay at large. Overall, the new mechanics are a mixed bag to me. The door camera light combo was very straightforward in the original game, and while this game does successfully nail the chaotic energy it was going for, I kind of feel like the balancing is all kinds of whack in the process. It's a juggling act of direct prevention and active self-defense, not too dissimilar to the original game's formula, but I feel like it can be too demanding at times, borderline unfair. Part of the pressure just comes from the fact that you are constantly being bombarded by animatronics, and the larger roster of foes and features makes it incredibly overwhelming after a point with preset time expectations that can forcibly overlap themselves to end your run. The micromanaging in this title is a bit much, and you often find yourself stretched thin, which that can sometimes cause more frustration than fear in later nights when you just happen to be dealt a hand that you were never realistically going to get out of, even if you did understand the mechanics very nicely. In this game, the mechanics don't really correlate with one another like how the originals does, and I think that just overall contributes to how splendidly that first game's gameplay felt compared to this one. While both games have mechanics that fight for your attention, the first game's mechanics all circle around one shared point, the power system. It entirely revolves around what you do with the power system. Are you going to use it for self-defense with the doors? Are you going to use it for information gathering with the lights and the camera? And I think part of this also just kind of comes with the fact that you can use multiple of these at the same time. You can turn on the lights while you have the doors open, which can mitigate some of the danger. You can also have the doors closed while you open the camera, but it's a dangerous, risky game because everything contributes to your power usage. So again, it's just a really nice flow because it all centers around one point. This game, however, uses three kind of unrelated mechanics all side by side. Two of them just branch off of your neutral state, which is your flashlight, which you can use to view down the giant hallway or at any of the two vents on the left or right side of your office. I think that it's because of this nature that it's just kind of like a little weird. It's kind of like rock, paper, scissors, I guess would be a good way to compare it. You're playing rock, paper, scissors with the animatronics. Are you going to have to use a Freddy mask against 90% of the cast? Are you going to have to remain in your neutral state in order to deal with Foxy? Or are you going to open your cameras to deal with the marionette's melodious mechanic? And I think it's because of that it's just a bit more hectic. The Freddy mask and the camera do not correlate with one another directly. You have to leave them to go into your neutral state to then immediately go to the opposite full commitment mechanic. And that's kind of rough because in the original game, your camera is the only thing you branch out of. Everything else happens in your neutral state. The camera is the only thing that changes it, but now you have two of them that you mandatorily have to use at the same time, so it's just a little tricky by comparison. I just don't really like the blend there, because sometimes you just get dealt a hand that it's impossible for you to get out of because of the overlap of these mechanics and the demands that they have. It's not like in FNAF 1 where at least it was somewhat fair in the sense that if you fumbled, that's on you. But sometimes with this game, you fumble because you don't get a say in it. You just get dealt a hand that you just weren't going to win the rock, paper, scissors is what I'm trying to say. That's ultimately what Five Nights at Freddy's 2's gameplay is in nature. I think it's inferior in comparison to that original game's formula. What I loved so much about that original game, the sequel kind of just chunks out. And I just don't think it's a very good blend. It's kind of rough, and, I just wish it was handled a little bit better. It honestly could have been so much worse. There was a scrapped toxicity mechanic that was attached to the mask, so you can only wear the mask for a certain period of time. That would have made it even worse than the gameplay already kind of is. It's probably the weakest part of this review for me. I honestly just don't like the gameplay very much. With that being said, though, I guess it's time for us to talk about the people that are directly responsible for why the gameplay and the mechanics exist in the first place. The Rogues Gallery this time around is much larger than the previous installment, now sporting nearly 3 times as many animatronics. They can be broken up into two separate categories, the withereds and the toys. There's a total of 5 withered animatronics, all of which are beaten up variations of the 5 from the original game, as well as 6 toy animatronics, most of which are cutesier high-tech models of their withered counterparts, though there are 2 new faces. They've got polish and pizzazz, and also the ability to connect to police databases to show predators who the real predators are. Chris Hansen would be proud. They honestly should be guarding you, but as per usual, there's some freaky stuff going on behind the scenes. From a design perspective, I think the Withereds and Mangle are the coolest by far. Seeing this decaying, broken up, visually jarring variation of the FNAF gang was really surprising for a lot of people at the time, and I do think the designs rock, although the Freddys are probably the weakest of the redesigns here, as their changes are very surface level. Anyway, Mangle though. Mangle I like. I mean, look at her. He's just so messed up from constantly being taken apart and being put back together as a children's entertainment piece. The fact they can just crawl around on the ceiling too like a big old spider is really creepy, but so cool at the same time. The designs in this game are pretty neat. I don't think they resonate with me in the same way that the classics from the first game do, but I think they fit perfectly with the general theme the game is going for. Since this game was released so shortly after the first, it's a bit difficult for me to say that these guys are really all that groundbreaking compared to the originals. They serve their purpose, but I don't think they could ever truly live to that same legacy that the first batch did. That's just from a design perspective that isn't even going into their mechanics. Right, the mechanics. I think for the sake of an easier understanding and less cluttered discussion, I'll be putting each of these animatronics into pairs since it makes it easier to go through them all. Most of them are parallels to another animatronic, although there is one exception to that, but we'll save them for last. Starting with the most basic of the pairs, we have Toy Bonnie and Toy Chica, who are functionally the regular Bonnie and Chica from the first game. They come at you from the right vent and left vent respectively, and you can see them in the opening to said vents. Flip the mask down on them, wait for them to do their little cutscene, and then they're off. They're not super crazy or unique, although Toy Bonnie is generally the most hated in the fact that his mask cutscene does not run on the same timer as the other animatronics, so this can lead to many botched nights, but outside of the hardest challenge in the game, this isn't really going to be super noticeable to the average player. They're just the most basic foes in this game. The next pair is their withered counterparts, Withered Bonnie and Withered Chica. These two actually appear in opposite vents from their toy successors, retaining their positions from the first game, with Withered Bonnie on the left vent and Withered Chica on the right vent. However, you can't actually see them in the opening of the vent, which makes them so much trickier compared to the toy animatronics. They'll enter your office, and then you put on the mask the moment you see them. They have a bit of a buffer period, so you won't die immediately if they get in, but you really shouldn't gamble with them for too long. There have been plenty of deaths on my playthrough from these guys because of that buffer. The next pair is the Freddys, specifically Toy Freddy and Withered Freddy. Both approach from that big hallway and make their way into your office. You put on the mask once more and wait for them to phase off. They're not super different from one another, but Withered Freddy doesn't get moving nearly as early into the week as Toy Freddy does, so he also has less phases to get to the office than Toy Freddy does to make up for it. The choice for him to start moving on night 3 is not unlike his first game's appearance, though the other Withereds also start getting active that night too, so it may be less an intended choice and rather a balancing coincidence. The next pair are the oddballs, Mangle and Balloon Boy. These two are a pair because they actually have a lot of parallels to one another. They are the only animatronics that appear through the vents like the Bonnies and Chicas that, well, aren't Bonnie or Chica. Much like Toy Bonnie and Toy Chica, you can also see them in the vent openings when they get in their pre-office phase. However, most apparent to them is that they are incredibly noisy. Balloon Boy has a signature laugh, and Mangle spews broken radio garbage, so you know when they're approaching from a mile away. Now, they also don't immediately kill you when they get into the office, but once they are in the office, your fate's sealed because you can't make them leave after that. Mangle just hangs from the ceiling, waiting for just the right moment to lunge down and nab you, and while Balloon Boy doesn't directly kill you, he takes your flashlight battery, so now you have no way of fending off Withered Foxy. So regardless of which of these two enter your office, you're going to die by a Foxy. I actually really like these two in the grand scheme of the game because I think they actively justify their mechanical similarities by finding ways to really stand out when you lay out all of their individual traits. The next pair are probably the single most important animatronics to the game's overall loop, and they hardly need any introduction. It's the Puppet and Withered Foxy. These two are my personal favorites in this game, mostly because of how emphasized their presence is by the overall gameplay mechanics. We actually get told in the Night 2 call specifically that these two are not bothered by the mask whatsoever, so these are the equalizers that keep the game from being super easy by wearing the mask all night. Now, I did mention my mixed feelings regarding said mechanics, but those mechanics help these two stand out amidst the crowd. There isn't really a point to me going into too much detail on these two from a mechanics perspective, since I already broke them down in the previous section, but I will say that, although I gave Foxy the title for Best Animatronic in the previous video, much as I enjoy his withered counterpart, I have to give the award to the puppet this time around. The puppet just has the benefit of world-building importance on top of their unique mechanic, which I'll go into more detail on later. And of course, picked last for the PE sports team, it's Withered Golden Freddy. Withered Golden Freddy is weird in this game. They don't show up until Night 6, and they actually have two different attack methods. They can either show up down the hall as a giant floating head, which you flash once like a camera before ignoring them, or they show up in your office, which means you need to put on the mask before they kill you. Withered Golden Freddy appears so late in the week that they're pretty easy to gloss over in the grand scheme of things. It's cool to have the mysterious Easter egg from the first game become a proper encounterable foe, but that's kind of where the novelty ends. Now, that actually does get me to the point where I should say that, from a technical perspective, not a lot of these guys are all that memorable at a glance, since most of them are just slight variations of one another's gameplay with a few quirks here and there. You actually have to really sit down and observe their patterns and traits to note just how different they are from one another, because their mechanics just tend to be overlooked as simply flashlight, music box, Freddy mask. I think part of this issue just comes from how bloated the roster is and how many are fended off by one singular mechanic. If the roster was halved, these quirks would be more noticeable, but then the game wouldn't be as chaotic and difficult as it was intended to be. If you kept only one member of each of these three pairs, I feel like the balancing would be a bit smoother and you wouldn't be put in nearly as many scenarios like the one I mentioned earlier, where you just get dealt a hand you aren't going to be able to get out of. I've had plenty of occasions where I've been double teamed by Withered Chica and Withered Bonnie back to back, and then just getting mauled by Withered Foxy or the Puppet because they just take so much valuable time away from these two, which wouldn't be an issue if there wasn't two of the same animatronic functionally in the game. I also just don't have as much to say about them individually because of the roster size. There's a lot of overlap between members, so I don't feel like they're as special as the first game made its characters. It's a shame because, with so many faces, I was hoping there'd be a little more outstanding than just lumping 9 of them into a check out this cool mask I found category, when having this number down of mask offenders to as little as 6, as opposed to 9, would have helped the balance and allowed more notable breathing room for them and the player. The animatronics are cool overall, there's plenty that earn their keep, but there are a few that honestly should have stayed in the parts and service room for this game. The plot is rather straightforward again, much like the first game. You're a night guard who's here to spend the week watching the facility. However, there is some fairly noticeable things that are different from the first game. Of course, I should make a clarification before we continue. I'll only be using material from the first 2 games, as that was what was available at the time. Later material is not going to contribute to what is said here. Now, let's get into it. When it comes to observing the narrative and lore of this game, there are actually significantly more places to check than before. In the first game, we only had the phone calls and the newspaper clippings on Cam 4B to get our info. Now, on top of these resources, we actually have the benefit of the paychecks, the midnight transition cutscenes, and the death minigames painting a picture for the greater scope of this game's world and story. I'll try to lay out and break down the story at large as concisely as possible, while pointing to what tells us what. First, we can establish that this game is actually not a sequel, but rather a prequel, courtesy of some of the details scattered across the game. Firstly, the phone guy's not dead. If you remember, he died during the week before the events of Five Nights at Freddy's 1 on the night for phone call, so the fact that he's alive is a clue to the game's true timeline placement. This game also gives us a specific date, courtesy of the paycheck, so we know that our week here at Freddy's ends on November 13th, 1987 as our night 6 shift concludes. This stands out to me because the only date we've been given with the first game was, well, 1987, in reference to the bite of 87. So the choice for the second game to be in the same year seems deliberate. So does the bite happen this week? Yeah, I'm thinking it does. During the phone call on night 5, we're told that a day shift spot has opened up and that's where we'll move up in the schedule. We also know that the establishment has been open for just a week before our shift, as Phone Guy mentions that the previous night guard only just finished his week before being moved to day shift. So the window for the bite to happen is incredibly small at this point. The week is incredibly hectic during the day shift, and whatever happens during the day leads to the establishment shutting down by the end of the game, with the final event being a birthday party slated for the day of Night 6. This, to me, means that the bite had to have happened anywhere between the day leading up to Night 5 shift, November 11th, 1987, to the actual birthday party scheduled for after the Night 6 shift, November 13th, 1987. Part of the reason that I feel this way is because of that mention of the Night 5 phone call, because it's a bit weird to me that the building starts to go on lockdown after this spot becomes available, so maybe the night guard was bit at that point. However, alternatively, another reason that I think it had to have happened between these dates is because of the fact that Phone Guy asked you to stay close to the animatronics and not let them hurt anyone at the birthday party tomorrow in the Night 6 phone call, so maybe that's foreshadowing? Either way, I feel like this game is as close to the bite as we'll ever get with the series, as we never really get a game set in the same year again down the road. So this somewhat answers the Bite of 87 mystery, but it's still super vague on the subject. I feel as though the culprit might have to be one of the toy animatronics, especially since to me it wouldn't make sense to scrap the toys and keep the wizards for a later establishment if one of the latter was the culprit, since we know that the toys are being trashed by the end of this game. Could it have been Mangle? Could it have been Toy Chica? It's not really clear who does it, but I'm fairly confident that it was probably one of the toys that did it. Speaking of the toys, that actually gets me to the next subject of the game's world building, the missing children's incident and the killer. This is our introduction to the main antagonist of early FNAF, and it's actually really in-depth with just how much info we can gather from our resources here. Courtesy of the phone calls, the first game's newspaper clippings, and the death minigames, we can get a general timeline of events for these first two titles. The death minigames are probably the single most important pieces to understanding the events leading up to these titles, which you can access at random on a game over. From what I can gather, chronologically, the Freddy Give Cake minigame comes first, with this minigame having Freddy deliver cake to children as a lone child stands outside the building crying. A purple car pulls up, with a purple guy stepping out before killing the kid and driving off, with the minigame ending with a jump scare from the puppet. This is super important to note because each of these minigames have a deliberately chosen jump scare to round them out, they're not random. So I presume that this is supposed to mean that this kid dies and goes on to haunt the puppet. This killing was the first of our main antagonist's murders. Then we have the Foxy Go 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 minigame, which follows Foxy running out of Pirate's Cove to celebrate a party with kids, though on the third run, the purple guy is present beside the Pirate's Cove, and Foxy runs in to find 5 dead kids, followed by a withered Foxy jump scare. I take this minigame to be the actual missing children's incident, the one mentioned in the FNAF 1 newspaper clippings. After that is the Puppets Give Gifts Give Life minigame, in which the puppet goes around the room to bring gift boxes to each of the 4 dead kids, before giving them life by placing each of them in a suit of the main cast, before, for a split second, we see a 5th child appear in the middle, followed by a withered Golden Freddy jump scare. This minigame just reconfirms what we suspected with the previous game, that Golden Freddy is the 5th victim of the missing children's incident. It also explains why the bodies were never found. Assumedly, the puppets stuffed the dead children in the suits to give them the opportunity to live on and eventually get revenge on their killer. This would explain the withered animatronics, especially since they will eventually be carried over into the later FNAF 1 establishment based on the end-of-week newspaper. We can also figure that based on the fact that the puppet is seen in the FNAF 1 location during the midnight transition cutscenes, which we know takes place after this game, so this will be relevant for that third title that'll be coming up later. However, that's not the end of the story with the death minigames. After the death of the child who becomes the puppet, the missing children's incident, and the puppet gives them life, all of which I presume happens at a previous establishment, possibly Fredbear's Family Diner given what the phone guy says, the FNAF 2 establishment opens, but this has some interesting implications in itself. During the phone calls, we actually get a lot of information about the history of Freddy's, especially with the toys. The toys are built to have connections to police databases and facial recognition. We also know later in the calls that the building is put on lockdown, especially when it comes to being on the lookout regarding former employees. We also know somebody snuck in the back of Freddy's and stole a yellow suit. You already know which one it'll end up being in the third game, and now none of the animatronics are acting right. These seemingly random details are actually incredibly important in helping paint a clear picture of her killer, the purple guy. He was a former employee, which would have given him all the means to kill these 6 kids and slip in and out. How do we know he slipped out? Well, if you remember in the previous video, one of the newspaper clippings states that a suspect was apprehended regarding the missing children's incident and the bodies were never found. Well,
there's a final death minigame that shows that the suspect was not the right guy. In this minigame, we play as Withered Freddy, and wander around the FNAF 2 location while an ominous voice spells out the words, "Save them." This is the only minigame that takes explicit place within the confines of the FNAF 2 establishment, and you have a chance of running into the purple guy who, upon making contact with you, causes the minigame to end with the text "You can't" appearing at the bottom left in response to the request to save the kids. This is genuinely terrifying to think about because this implies that not only was the true killer not apprehended, since the same guy is present in all of these 3 minigames despite 2 separate killings, but also that the purple guy is actively in the building during this week you're here, and is directly responsible for why the toys are designed the way they are, why everything is going haywire, and what eventually leads to the closure of the establishment. While the purple guy will eventually evolve into the tech whiz, remnant studying, I always come back Fazbear Entertainment head William Afton in later games, just this first appearance alone paints him in such a dark and realistic way. He's a criminal hiding in plain sight, and he could strike again at any point. We have a face to the killings in the missing children's incident, which wasn't even his first time doing it, and now the kids can't move on until their killer is given exactly what he deserves. I think it makes for a very interesting antagonist that has so many layers in just 2 games, who isn't even physically present to the player, so I think the world building in this really works, and it puts together and grows off of the first game in really fascinating ways.
Much like in the first game, this game also comes with the addition of a bonus, more difficult Night 6, and the Custom Night option that serves as your Night 7, both of which grant you an additional star to your main menu as before. However, unlike that original game, the Custom Night actually has a lot of options to mix and match now with the extended roster of enemies. There are a total of 8 preset challenges, with the 420 challenge being the one that gives you the 3rd star that you're after, though completing each of the 7 additional challenges rewards you with individual desk decorations that prove your mettle against the machines. You may notice that the puppet is nowhere to be found here on the character selection screen, which this is due to the fact that her mechanic doesn't functionally have a level range. It's inherently more difficult to deal with due to the level of the other animatronics rather than one that operates on a level like the others. Withered Foxy also notably doesn't vanish entirely, even if you set him to 0 on the custom night screen, which further emphasizes just how important he is to the game's overall gameplay loop, because he's still mandatory in custom night encounters that he's not even a part of. There's comparatively more to do here with the custom night option, so rather than just 7 nights, it's closer to 14 if you count the base 5 nights, the extra night 6, and the 8 custom night challenge nights, so it's already got more replayability than the first game does, roughly double the amount of levels in fact. Now, outside of this more expansive custom night feature, just like with the first game, later releases added the addition of cheats, such as unlimited battery, radar, and faster nights, but that's ultimately where it cuts off in terms of additional features. I will briefly say that I love the fact that because Withered Bonnie has no face, his icon on the radar map is just the Bonnie plush instead. Funny little detail aside, FNAF 2 is definitely better in the feature department compared to the original, as there's notably more to do, although this is a bit of a double-edged sword for me, given my complaints about the gameplay and execution of its mechanics earlier in this review. So the expanded custom night, while nice, and I do think that it's better, definitively, it comes with the issue of requiring me to engage with a not nearly as appealing gameplay loop more than I would like to in order to get everything. Ultimately, would you rather have more to do with less finesse, or would you rather a more refined yet less feature-heavy experience? That's the question, and I think that while it excels at giving me more to do, this is just dampened by my not-so-enthusiastic feelings on its gameplay. It kind of makes me realize that making reviews is a complicated business. Nothing is ever so black and white, and this section made it really clear to me. It's better in its features, but what's the point in having better features if your gameplay just isn't fun?
Why bother?
That's just a really crazy thing that you just gotta think about, because a game could be really good in a lot of other departments, but ultimately just flop at its core gameplay, and then it's like, is it really worth the credit that it's given? Let's just move on to my final verdict, okay? Following in the footsteps of the original game, Five Nights at Freddy's 2 exploded on the internet, stoking the flames and taking advantage of the, at the time, very recent popularity of the first game's success. Let's Players, theorists, and the fandom at large had a field day, especially with the new lore and approach to the first game's formula, with some of the more notable members of the community even getting their start with this entry in particular, such as Dawko, 8-Bit Ryan, and Daz, all of who I remember watching theories and gameplay from at the time, and it makes me glad to see they're still actively involved within the community and YouTube after all this time, even making appearances in the Five Nights at Freddy's movie as Employee of the Month cameos. I can't say that I personally had too many feelings at the time that really stuck with me for this game the way that Five Nights at Freddy's 1 did, but it was still a pretty memorable time, especially since this was about the time that I feel that fan games were really beginning to pick up for the series, and I mean, there's just so many of them. With a colorful new cast of characters, further and somewhat more direct world-building elements, somewhat improved replayability, and a sometimes hectic and less than elegant collection of new gameplay mechanics, I think I can comfortably put this game in the B tier. While it enhances the features complaint I had with the first game by providing more replayability options, I just feel like the gameplay structure itself is not nearly as good or well implemented as the prior entry in the series, which I think damages its overall score the most for me. The animatronics in this game are quite distinct as well, but most of them lack uniqueness despite there being so many of them, and I think that's ultimately a shame given the circumstances. Everything else is pretty good and enhances what came before, but those can only get you so far when the gameplay is just overall not very good. I feel that's ultimately where Five Nights at Freddy's 2 drops the ball the most, so I feel rather confident in the tier level that I'm going to be giving it. From here, Five Nights at Freddy's 2 would continue the hype train, eventually leading into the third entry in the series just a few months later in the following year, and a film adaptation for the game is set to release later this year on December 4th, 2025, following the success of that first movie. The designs that I praised in this review for the animatronics translated so nicely to the trailer footage we've seen, so I am stoked to see how this movie plays out. Much like before, Five Nights at Freddy's 2 is available on consoles for $8, Steam for $5, and on mobile for $3. Although, like I mentioned last year in the Five Nights at Freddy's 1 video, I played this game using the Core Collection on my Switch 2, which runs for $40 on consoles and comes with the first 5 games in the series. With that said though, I think we can call this night complete and close the book on another entry in the Five Nights at Freddy's series. We look forward to talking about the third game around this time next year, and with that, I wish you all a happy Halloween. Go enjoy the festivities, treat yourself to some tricks, whatever spooky delights you may get yourself into, and remember, there's so much in store here at Game & Lore.